And my question is connected with somebody called Randall Helms, who wrote a book called The Gospel Fictions. And his idea is that, rather like you said, the empty tomb could be based upon the story of Jonah or upon Daniel coming out of the lion's den. And it is not the fact that he seems to suggest that it's not so much that these are written after to explain these events, but they are actually creations by the gospel writers.
Yeah.
So the whole of the resurrection story is really based upon Old Testament stories that have been elaborated, and somewhere along the line something must have caused it, but it certainly wasn't the resurrection story as given in the Gospels.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could comment on this Randall Helms. You
Sure.
probably know him.
I think that this is trying to repeat with Jewish texts the same disastrous mistake that scholars in the late 19th, early 20th century tried to do with pagan texts. Namely, you cherry pick these other ancient texts for similar points to what happens in the gospel narratives, and then you extrapolate by saying the gospel narratives are based on these other texts. And this movement collapsed within biblical scholarship with regard to pagan sources. And I think it's equally invalid. Let me give you an illustration. The point is that you can cherry pick similarities for almost any story that you want to and find similarities and parallels. For example, here in Southampton, I think people would probably know about that incredible maritime tragedy that occurred about 100 years ago when this huge passenger ship, which had been called and touted as unsinkable on a cold April night in the North Atlantic, about 200 miles off of Newfoundland, struck an iceberg and sank. And over half of the passengers' lives were lost because there weren't enough lifeboats on board the ship. And the name of this ship was it
Titanic.
Titan, wasn't it?
Titanic.
No, Peter, I'm not talking about the Titanic. I'm talking about a novel written in 1898, 14 years before the wreck of the Titanic, called The Wreck of the Titan. Now, isn't that amazing? Anyone reading that book would say, aha, this must be based on this event, or that this event is a legendary construction out of this earlier book, when in fact this is just cherry picking these sorts of parallels. And similarly, look at the story of Joshua and killing the 5 kings in the cave. He puts the kings in the cave, and then he brings them out and he kills them all. Is that supposed to be the source of the story of the empty tomb? They're utterly dissimilar, it seems to me. Mark has no mention of Jesus being the king. The absence of titles is conspicuous. There isn't anything in Mark about the guard who slays the people. The fact is that this is just cherry-picked a couple of similarities, like the kings being in a cave and the stones being put over the entrance to keep them in there before they drag him out and kill him. Or the same with Daniel and the lion's den. The story isn't at all similar to the empty tomb, except that there's a stone over the lion's den, and the king comes in the morning and opens the stone to see if Daniel is alive. The point is, you can cherry pick these kind of similarities with anything. And the very multiplicity of these, Daniel and the lion's den, Joshua and the 5 kings in the cave, suggests that in fact these are not derived from or based on these Old Testament stories. But I think rather, as I've argued, they have a sound basis in historical fact.